Hi, I'm going to quickly review some evidence that underlies some of the claims that Ed made, mostly evidence that's been uncovered in the last few years. And most of this evidence is about the properties of these value-added models, not about what happens when you use them. Mostly because we just don't have any evidence yet about what happens when you use these models in high-stakes settings. But the properties tell us a lot about what we should expect, and we have lots of experience in other fields that I'll talk about that tell us a lot about what we should expect. So I'm going to talk about 4 important facts about value-added that we've learned that have been found in study after study, and that all 4 of them cut against the use of value-added in a simple-minded, high-stakes system. The first fact is that these estimates are extremely noisy, that luck matters an enormous amount to whether a teacher is found to be effective or ineffective, matters in almost all cases more than the teacher's actual effectiveness. The second fact is that a teacher's estimated effectiveness depends a lot on which test the students are given. That if you give kids one test, teacher A looks effective. If you give kids another test, teacher A looks terrible and teacher B looks effective. These are typically studies where we don't have any strong reason to think that one test is better than the other. The third result is that the short-term effects that value-added models are meant to estimate, effects on the scores at the end of this year, those effects really don't persist very long at all, and in many cases are reversed a year later. So that a teacher who's very effective for this year's score may be very ineffective for getting the kids to do better in the long run. And a fourth result is that value-added estimates reward teachers importantly for which students they get, as well in addition to or instead of how well they do with those students. The models are supposed to solve this problem that different teachers teach different types of students, but they manifestly don't solve the problem. So let me go through some of the evidence on this. This is from a recent study, a recent summary of the evidence. This is based on 5 Florida school districts, where teachers were assigned a grade A through F in year 1, and then they were assigned a grade A through F in the year 2. And you can look and see whether the A teachers this year were also the A teachers next year, which is what you would expect if the grade is actually capturing the teacher's effectiveness. What you see is that a teacher who gets an A this year is somewhat more likely to get an A next year than a teacher who got, say, an F this year, but not a whole lot more likely. And if you break it down, it turns out that a quarter of the teachers who got an A this year get a D or an F next year. Almost half of them get a C or lower. 30% of teachers who get an F this year get an A or a B next year. Half of them get a C or better. This is just noise. That's how much noise is in these systems, that you can't really take very seriously a grade any particular year, and it's going to look awfully bad for your system if teachers' grades bounce around that much. And in fact, we've seen this in a few studies where teachers were given grades over and over again, that they started out believing in the system, and after a couple years where they bounce around from an A one year to a D the next year to a B the next year, they start to think, this system is junk, and they lose all faith in it. And I think that's something that we just have to be prepared to expect. These estimates are extremely noisy. Even averaging over a few years, which has been proposed to solve this problem, doesn't go very far towards solving the problem unless you're going to wait 10 years or something like that, and that's not very useful. Now let me move on to issues other than noise. I think noise is an extremely important issue, but let's set aside the noise. Imagine that we had thousands and thousands of students for every teacher, and we could get rid of the noise problem. Another issue that has come up over and over again is the question of whether value-added models are measuring a teacher's effectiveness or whether they're in fact measuring what the teacher emphasizes. These models are based on a view of education where there's only one dimension of student achievement, there's only one dimension of teacher effectiveness. Any decent test that we have is going to measure that achievement and is going to measure the effectiveness, and it doesn't really matter what we choose. In fact, that's not the reality. It turns out to matter enormously which test you use. So one recent study conducted by the Gates Foundation as part of their Measures of Effective Teaching project, they found that if you take the teachers who are in the top quartile in terms of their estimated impacts on the state test, set aside all the noise concerns, imagine you had an infinitely large sample of students, and then look at the value added of those teachers for an alternative test that's designed to be more conceptually demanding. So a test that doesn't just ask you to name the procedure, but actually ask you to implement things. Only about 20 to 30% of the teachers who are in the top quartile on the state test are in the top half on the alternative test. So it looks like there are some teachers who are very good for state tests and other teachers who are very good for the more conceptually demanding tests, and they're not the same set. Another result found that if you look at the same test and look at different subscores, so for example, a math test might have a procedure subscore and a problem-solving subscore, A teacher's estimated effectiveness for one subscore is not very closely related with the effectiveness for another subscore. A third result is that teachers' effects on high-stakes tests are only somewhat related to their effects on low-stakes tests. And even more worryingly, the high-stakes effects fade out much more quickly than the low-stakes effects. If an effect fades out very quickly, that might suggest that what we're picking up is the extent to which the teacher is teaching to the test, rather than the extent to which the teacher is really encouraging students to learn something. If we see that the test that the teacher is encouraged to teach to, we see big effects on it, but then they disappear immediately or very quickly, that really suggests that a lot of what we're picking up is how good the teacher is at teaching to the test, rather than how good the teacher is at teaching. And so this really gets at a question that we've tended to think that we didn't need to answer, and we could just be technocrats and implement these models and not have to come up with substantive answers. But it turns out that these models encode an answer to each of these questions, which is what is it that we want teachers to do? Do we want teachers to be teaching math and reading and nothing else, or do we want them to be teaching social studies and science and citizenship and all the other subjects in the curriculum? Do we want them to teach topics and skills that aren't covered by the state test, or do we just want them to teach the names of the programs that each president implemented? And do we care about encouraging long-run learning or just doing well on the end-of-year test? Value-added models are only going to encourage math and reading, the topics and skills covered by the test, and the short run. If that's what we care about, then these models may be what we want. But if we think that we want teachers to be doing other things, value-added estimates are gonna penalize that. A second issue, unrelated to the issue of what it is that these models are picking up, has to do with bias due to the fact that not all teachers teach random samples of students. We know this isn't true. We know that if anybody has a kid in school, there's lots of involvement of parents and teachers and principals in designing classes. And you might think that that has some effect on the average test scores at the end of the year in the class, even controlling for the beginning of the year tests. And it turns out that that's true. Turns out that it's very rare to see schools where there is random assignment or random assignment conditional on a few prior variables. Value-added models are supposed to be robust to small deviations from random assignment, but it turns out that the real-world deviations are much bigger than that. That the assumptions you need for the value-added models to uncover causal effects just don't seem to hold in the real world. And so what that means is that the value-added score that a teacher gets is going to be importantly sensitive to which student the teacher teaches. And since this is research I did, and since it was supported by the Institute for Education Sciences, and I see my grant officer in the room, I should mention that this is IES-supported research. But what I did to try to evaluate this was look for effects that we knew shouldn't be there. So we know that a fifth grade teacher can't possibly affect their kids' third grade test scores. They haven't met the kids yet. But it turns out you can tweak value-added models and estimate effects of fifth grade teachers on third grade test scores. Since we know the true effect is 0, if these models are picking up true effects, they should indicate that fifth grade teachers have in fact 0 effects on third grade test scores. But what the models indicate is that fifth grade teachers have large effects on third grade test scores. And that's true under all of the different varieties of value-added models that are out there. What that's telling us is that there are important differences in the third grade test scores of kids assigned to different teachers that aren't captured by the value-added models. And that's going to create biases for or against teachers who teach students of different types. And so for example, if research studies tend to leave out all sorts of exceptional teachers who teach ELL classes, teachers who teach special ed classes. We tend to leave them out because they're too complicated, but it's clear that if you actually do this in practice, it's going to be very important whether you teach a special ed class or an ELL class or a mainstream class in terms of determining what your estimated value added is. Even among the set of regular classes, it's going to matter a lot whether you get kids who did unusually well last year and are likely to revert back to their long run mean this year and do less well and you'll look bad, or teachers who did unusually badly last year and you'll look great when they go back to what you would expect from them. And so these are all going to be issues with these models. As a sense of the magnitude of this issue, you can look at the LA Times data that the LA Times recently released when they came up with estimates of each teacher in Los Angeles's value added. Those data were reanalyzed by Briggs and Domingue, and what they found is that the effects of the teachers that students hadn't yet had at least in reading, were as large as the effects of the teachers the students had already had. Now, the teachers they hadn't yet had couldn't possibly have had real effects. So if you're finding large effects of that, that should make you awfully cautious about interpreting the estimated effects of the teachers they have had. A lot of what you're likely to be picking up is the student assignments rather than the teacher effectiveness. And this result is very robust. My study was based on data from North Carolina. You get similar results in Texas, in Florida, in San Diego, in New York City. Essentially everywhere where we have enough data to estimate these models, you can find that non-random assignments matter an enormous amount for these models. So why does this matter? It matters because they tell us what's likely to happen if we start to take these models seriously in evaluating teachers, if we start to build stakes onto these models. There's something in education that's actually true across the social sciences known as Campbell's Law, which states that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it's intended to monitor. That is, it's always easier, if we have a flawed measure, it's always easier for a teacher to target the flaws in the measure rather than the reality. Now, there's no reason for a teacher to do that as long as we're not putting stakes on these estimates. But if we start telling the teacher, your job's on the line unless you get a high enough value-added measure, the obvious way to do that is to target the flaws in the model, to start teaching to the test, to start trying to manage which students you teach, and to start focusing on short-term drilling rather than long-term learning. And so you can expect all of those things to get worse if we put high stakes on these estimates. You can expect the teachers to lobby their principals for the right students and to refuse to teach the wrong ones. It's going to be a lot harder to recruit a teacher for that ELL class if they know that they're likely to get fired for teaching it. The teachers will shift their focus to the content and the material of the chosen test, ignore other subjects and ignore topics that aren't covered very well by the test. They're not going to spend as much time on writing because the test, it's too expensive to test writing, and so they'll spend their time drilling analogies instead. You can expect that they'll shift towards drills aimed at short-term performance and ignore the sorts of things that promote long-term learning. You can expect teacher cooperation and collegial support is likely to erode as the teachers realize they're in competition with each other. And as we've seen in recent years, you can expect that outright cheating will rise. That in most states, the way we administer tests is the teacher is given the packet of tests for all of their students and asked to administer them. There's no way you can do that if you're going to put stakes on it. And even if you figure out ways to proctor exams, there will be ways to manipulate the results and cheat. And we saw that in Atlanta recently. We'll see that elsewhere. And then there's all sorts of more obscure forms of cheating. There was a study that found that the week before state assessments, students were more likely to be suspended if they'd scored poorly the previous year. That there are all sorts of ways that you can manipulate your scores that are not, in fact, true effectiveness. And so what that means is that the result of putting high stakes on value-added measures is likely to be not what we intended. Lots of good teachers will be fired, lots of bad teachers will get bonuses, and teachers will focus on raising their measured value-added whether or not that corresponds to effective teaching. So you can be pretty sure that measured scores will go up, but it's not at all clear that learning will go up. It could easily go down. And this is something we've learned over and over again in other professions. If you have a measure that has these sorts of imperfections, you can't put too high stakes on it because you'll completely destroy the value that the measure has and create all sorts of distortions that you don't want. So I've got a page of references in the slides if you're interested in evidence on these, in digging up the details, but thank you.